Hi everyone, welcome to United States History to 1877. This is module number 4, discussion questions covering chapters 10, 11, and 12 from our course. My name is Tyler Rust. I'm your instructor and your guide as we go through the United States History to 1877 together. And this is our 4th module. I'm really excited about going through these chapters with you today. And so we will have this as an introduction, and then we'll continue on our next live session where I'm excited to hear your answers to these discussion questions. So please try and join us for that next discussion that we're going to be having. And if you can't, remember, it will be posted on the YouTube group page as well as on the Facebook group page that we started for United States History 1877 through Study Dojo. One other announcement before we get down to work is that I wanted to alert you to a new offering from Study Dojo that I'm coming out with in the near future. This is a new course I'm entitling Read, Write, and Use History, a transformational course to help all people of any interest level to read, write, and use history more effectively, to be more influential, and to understand how history can make you more effective through reading and through writing. So check that out. That's also at studydojo.thinkific.com. You can even subscribe in order to have early access to that course when it comes available later in the month. So with that being said, let's get down to work on our first discussion group. These are Chapter 10. Chapter 10 is about religion and reform in United States history, and it focuses primarily on the years about 1820 through 1860. The two discussion questions are: how did Americans respond to the Second Great Awakening, and why did anti-slavery Americans begin to demand the immediate abolition of slavery? So we'll take these one at a time because they're very big questions and there's a lot of information here to talk about. The first question, how did Americans respond to the Second Great Awakening, is important because the Second Great Awakening really transformed the 19th century, not just in terms of religious belief, but also in terms of social practice, political practice, and even economic practices. So with that being said, I want to lay out some examples of what the Second Great Awakening did and why. The reason for the Second Great Awakening is important to understand in terms of the First Great Awakening. Obviously, they are of same name, similar name, because they're both about religious awakenings in American history. The First Great Awakening, as you might remember, was really born out of the Protestant Reformation, where the Catholic Church was breaking up and religious believers in places like England were forming their new church, the Church of England, but there were some people who felt that they were inappropriate, that it wasn't the right way, and that they were seeking a way to reform the Church of England through their example of living in the new colonies like the Massachusetts Bay Colony with the Puritans, where they had set out to really reform the Church of England. That's the First Great Awakening. The Second Great Awakening is different from the First Great Awakening in that it's not trying to reform a church as much as the Second Great Awakening is when people are trying to reform themselves in their relationship to God. The Second Great Awakening is when we see the birth of many new religions, American-born Christian religions, where people are interpreting their own relationship with God in new ways, often based on their experience living in North America. And there were many, many religions that were born in the early 19th century out of this Second Great Awakening, when people really dove back into religious faith, but reinterpreted it in a new way. Some examples of this would include the Unitarians. The Unitarian faith, which is still around today, included the idea that Jesus Christ, the seminal character from the Christian Bible, was not in fact the Son of God. Now, that idea that Jesus is not the Son of God is a radical reinterpretation of what many Christians hold to be the essential teaching of the Bible and the Christian faith, that Jesus was the Son of God. But Unitarians believe that Jesus was a man who achieved a divine status, and that example of how Jesus lived was the real message that they wanted to latch onto. And so that radical reinterpretation of Christianity by Unitarians is one example of how people were re-examining their own faith and coming up with an individual interpretation for themselves. Another example of this would be groups like the Mormon faith, right? They're also known as the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, where the leaders, Joseph Smith, reinterpreted the Bible and even added the Book of Mormon onto the Bible as a way of showing a new understanding of Christianity that included a North American chapter. That makes Mormons perhaps the most patriotic of all American Christian faiths. They really do believe that, for example, Jesus came to North America. And in that sense, by tying their experience in North America into their Christian belief system, patriotism and the North American history really play a significant role in that Christian interpretation. So the response to the Second Great Awakening is essentially the launching of new individual and American-born Christian belief systems. So the second question here is, why did anti-slavery Americans begin to demand the immediate abolition of slavery? And these two questions, the first and the second, are very much connected to one another, because with this new interpretation, this individual relationship with God coming out of the Second Great Awakening, people began to examine their own experience and responsibility for slavery. While many Americans could say they didn't own slaves and so they were fine because they didn't do anything wrong, this time showed many Americans saying no, that their relationship with God would be one based upon their actions while alive and how they tried to live a Christian lifestyle. A Christian lifestyle that they would have to answer for when they arrived at the pearly gates after dying. And to be asked by God, what did you do to stop slavery, led many Americans to begin to demand the immediate abolition of slavery because of their moral and spiritual responsibility to live a life as a good Christian as they saw it, as they understood it. One of the more interesting examples of this would be a painting, and I'll share it with you, a painting by Frederick Turner that shows a slave ship crashing on the rocks. This slave ship, of course, is symbolic of the American slave trade, the American slavery system, and the story shows slaves drowning in the ocean. A terrible, terrible way to go. But while the imagery is sad and terrible, the power of the painting comes through the face of God that Turner paints into the painting. And you have to take some time to find it. I won't tell you where it is, but there's a face. And the only hint I'll give you about this painting is that the face of God is not looking at the slaves drowning in the ocean or the ship crashing on the rocks. The face of God is looking out of the painting at the viewer, at you and me. And that is very much the message to people at this time period. God is watching you watch the horrors of slavery. And God is wondering what you are going to do about it. And in that sense, that's the response Americans had to the Second Great Awakening and why Americans began to demand the immediate abolition of slavery. But there's more to this question, obviously. We'll go on, though, because I want to dive deeper into this when we have our live session, and I hope you'll join me for that live session. But Chapter 11 is next, and Chapter 11 is about the Cotton Revolution, which really made the South one of the wealthiest regions in the world. The explosion of cotton onto the world market came through new technologies that were developed, as well as the expansion of American territory to allow for greater agricultural production of cotton, and sadly, the expansion of American slavery. Now, the two discussion questions in Chapter 11 for us are, how did white Southerners justify slavery, and how did enslaved people endure their oppression? So let's take this one at a time. Very interestingly, there are three ways that I would name, and I'm sure there's more, but there are three that I would name for how white Southerners justified slavery. The first being they would use the Bible, right? Remember, this is the Second Great Awakening, and the Bible is a very strong influence in everyone's life, especially Southerners. And they would point to the presence of slavery in the Bible and passages justifying slavery in the Bible as a way to defend their own use of slavery. This is offensive by today's standards, and it was even offensive by standards at that time. But it is an example of how the Bible has been used throughout American history to justify oppression against others, particularly minorities in American society. And we see it here with the defense of slavery, but also we've seen it more recently in defense of bigotry and prejudice against LGBTQ plus individuals and that community, where it's argued that they do not deserve equal rights under the law because of the Bible. And this is a question that will come back again and again, but I think for us as historians, we need to point out that the Bible is often used to justify the taking away of rights of individuals in American history. And we have to decide for ourselves whether we agree or disagree with that. I myself, being very much in favor of the egalitarianism in American history, would find that the denial of rights for LGBTQ plus people is just as wrong, although not as monstrous as American slavery. The second question is, how did enslaved people endure their oppression? Now, this is a fascinating one. I'm sorry. I have to back up. White Southerners also justified slavery economically. They claimed that it was the cornerstone of the American economy, and it was. Slaves were worth close to $5 billion at the time of 1860. And that's an enormous amount of money even by today's standards. But back then, it represented the most valuable resource in the American economy. In fact, in all of North America, slaves were the most valuable resource in all of North America. And that would have been used to justify keeping slavery. Southerners would have said there's way too much money caught up in this, you can't possibly get rid of slavery. And the third and final way that slavery was justified by Southerners was that it was a socially needed institution, that the slaves would not be allowed or able to survive on their own, that African American slaves were helpless, like children who needed their masters, like children needed their parents in order to survive, that without slavery, the African Americans would starve, become homeless, penniless, and vagrant. And all of that is absolutely untrue, but it was used to justify slavery nonetheless. So, second question, how did enslaved people endure their oppression? This is a fascinating one as well. And there's always been rebellions against slavery by the slaves. We've seen all the way back to the Stonewall Rebellions, but also including the famous Nat Turner's Rebellion and Gabriel Vesey's Rebellion, among others. Many, many slave rebellions throughout American slave history. And so we need to understand that any claims that slaves wanted to be slaves or enjoyed or benefited from slavery is not supported by any evidence. Now, when these slave rebellions would take place, of course, there was overwhelming violence against the slaves that put them down. In fact, many innocent slaves would often be killed as, quote, good measure, end quote, to keep other slaves from rising up. And so the violence shown against rebellions kept them from rising up. But rebellions would take place in less obvious ways. In terms of work shortages, work stoppages, or slowdowns. Slaves would break their tools or work very slowly. And these were ways that the slaves could rebel without necessarily losing their lives or being abused. Now, a couple of things to point out here are the legacies of these slave rebellions, both subtle and violent. Slave rebellions that were violent, like Nat Turner's Rebellion, led to not only claims that white people had a constitutional need for weapons and the Second Amendment to the Constitution, we have to remember it was born out of the desire for white people to control slave rebellions, that this sacred right to bear arms is actually born out of white supremacy. The other thing that came out of slave rebellions was, of course, slave patrols that were necessary to protect white supremacy from the violence of slave uprising. And these slave patrols then later became the first police departments. And so law enforcement in American history has a direct connection to slavery. And we need to understand that, because while today I would not accuse a police officer of being in favor of slavery, the system under which those honorable men and women serve has a legacy that is important to understand. If you don't understand the slavery origins of policing and the Second Amendment, you might misunderstand some of the abuses of those systems and misplace any criticism of those systems as criticisms of those honorable people who are trying to uphold the law through their service. Now, slaves also, when they would break their tools or work slowly, painted the picture in the minds of white Americans that slaves were somehow stupid or lazy or clumsy. All racist stereotypes that would continue to haunt African Americans for over 100 years after the end of slavery, that blacks are somehow dumb or clumsy or lazy, is still often a criticism leveled by white supremacists and bigots against the African American community. And it's absolutely untrue. We just need to understand where that stereotype comes from. Now, our final slide, our final discussion questions for today are Chapter 12 on Manifest Destiny. And this is one of my favorite images. I've put it on the front cover of our text and reading guide, and that is of a 100-foot tall, scantily clad woman floating across the American plains, leading white settlers and chasing away Native Americans. I like it because it's so ridiculous, not because I agree with it. I don't agree with it. But I do think it represents what many Americans did agree with, which was that Manifest Destiny was somehow divine or ordered by God. The idea that white people should colonize and conquer all of North America was justified by a myth that said God wanted it this way. And that is obviously untrue and unfounded by any evidence whatsoever. But I do think it's funny to point out a 100-foot tall, scantily clad woman is somehow relevant in history. So the first question, was the early United States an empire? I would have to say absolutely, although you could say no, because of course this is a country founded against empire. But the United States in the early 19th century was acting very much like an empire. And both in terms of seizing of territory and natural resources, but also through direct control by establishing new colonies in territories outside of its boundaries. And so this early empire is important to understand, because we are eventually going to become a more formalized empire at the turn of the 20th century. So questions about empire feed off of questions about identity, which feed off of questions about moral superiority that Manifest Destiny was created to justify. And then the second question, did American growth help or hinder national unity? This one I think is also equally as double-sided, in that you could answer it both ways. It helped and it hindered, and it depends on your reading of the evidence. American growth helped national unity because, of course, it sparked the American identity. It sparked the imagination. Horace Greeley, for example, who encouraged go west young man, that there was somehow a mission here that would benefit not only the individuals but the country, and that it was somehow a destiny that needed to happen. That helps to unify a country around its mission, for right or for wrong. But it also hinders national unity, in that with all of this expansion, you're going to see expansion of slavery. And debates over the expansion of slavery are going to lead to greater and greater national disunity. Indeed, as slavery began to expand, we see a breakdown of American politics. And remember that the essence of politics is compromise, and that if you cannot compromise, politics has come to an end. And time and again, from 1820 onward, from the Missouri Compromise onward, we're going to see a refusal by the American southern states to compromise on the expansion of slavery, that there must be an expansion of slavery or else. And that or else is always secession and civil war. And time and again, reformers, abolitionists, and anti-slavery advocates in the North had to accept the expansion of slavery, regardless of the fact that it needed to end, and many of the founding fathers also felt so. But as the Southerners continued to refuse to compromise, we are being pushed closer and closer to civil war, as abolitionists eventually will give up on the moral arguments against slavery and come to see violence as their only other option. And we see that, of course, with the story of John Brown. So those are the discussion questions for module number 4. I hope that you enjoyed them and that they sparked some thought on your part. I'm greatly looking forward to hearing our discussion during our next live session. Please try to join us there on our Facebook page if you can. The recording will be posted. It'll also be posted on our YouTube page. And I want to make one final plug for you to check out studydojo.thinkific.com for our new course, which we are taking pre-registrations for now. That is Read, Write, and Use History. And this one I think you'll enjoy because not only does it show you the transformational skills available when you read, write, and use history, but we'll continue our walk through U.S. history, covering it from 1877 onward. All right, that's it for me. I appreciate your time and your attention, and I look forward to seeing you at our next live session. Thank you very much.